Well, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay.
We've got another long lesson tonight, so we've got to move through it fairly quickly, I hope. Lord, again, we come together to study your word and to see what you have tonight. I pray you will anoint the word as it goes out, anoint my lips to say what you'd have me to say, and then anoint our hearts so that we will catch those things that you have for us. And we'll thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, tonight we get to cover one of the fun stories in the Bible. Probably heard it sometime you were a kid. David and Goliath. And we're going to get into that tonight and take a look at it. We're going to start off with David being anointed king. You remember last week that God had Samuel go to Saul and tell him, look, you were supposed to wipe that whole tribe out. You didn't do it. You didn't do it. So therefore, I'm taking the kingship away from you. You're no longer king. Now that was as far as God was concerned. Remember, the people elected Saul. They all got together, remember, had the meeting, and yeah, they'll agree with God's recommendation, and so they made him king. But you remember Samuel told him that God had taken the kingdom from him, and that Saul went back to Ramah and Samuel went back to Ramah and did not meet with Saul again. So for the remaining years, however long that was, that Saul reigned, he did not have Samuel with him. All right. Now that's kind of an important thing as we go through this. We'll see how that affected Israel. All right, let's start 1 Samuel chapter 16, beginning with verse 1. Now the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." But the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you, and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Then invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will do what you shall do. You shall anoint for me the one I name to you." So Samuel did what the Lord said and went to Bethlehem. And the elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, "Do you come peaceably?" And he said, "Peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. All right. So we learn right off the bat that Samuel had been in mourning over Saul for some time. We know from last week that Samuel went home to pray for Saul. That was what he was doing. But evidently it became to the point that Samuel was focused on Saul. If you look at that and you kind of wonder what's going on, but we have to understand there is a long time period here, probably 30 years, that Samuel had been ruling Israel with Saul. You remember Saul was the king, but Samuel was still the priest and the prophet. And he acted as judge when he needed to, but he was primarily the priest and the prophet. And so he worked with Saul. And we know they had an agreement whenever Saul wanted to go out to battle or go and fight, that he had to go and wait for Samuel to come, and they would inquire of the Lord, and then they would go out to battle. And Samuel usually went with him. So for 30 years, they had been working together, and now God tells him, "I'm done with him. I'm not going to keep him king. He's cut off. That's it." and the Spirit of the Lord lifted from Saul. And so for that, Samuel was in mourning. How long, we don't know. But it was long enough that I think God kind of got his dander up, a little bit. He says, Samuel, I can hear God, because he seemed to talk to Samuel, in person. I can see God coming down to Samuel and say, Samuel, how much longer are you going to mourn? Don't you get it? I have rejected Saul. When God rejects something, it is rejected. You can pray from here until the time you die. It's not going to change it. When God rejects something, it is rejected until he decides, if he decides, to unreject it. We can't control God, because he's going to do what he wants to do and what he feels he needs to do. So Samuel is commanded by God. Now, you kind of get this. Well, how much longer are you going to mourn? He's been rejected. All right, so let's get that over with. Now, here, I got something for you to do. I want you to fill your horn. Now, probably that was either an ox horn, or it probably wasn't a sheep's horn like they would use for the shofar, because those are long and so it was probably something like a short ox or cow, steer horn, something of that nature. He says, you fill that up with oil, and I'm going to send you to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, and you're going to anoint me a king. Sounds very much like he did with David, doesn't it? Very much the same. But there's a difference here. And that is found in this simple statement. And that's at the end of verse 1. He says, for I have provided myself a king. With Saul, the people demanded a king, and so God said, I will provide for them a king. And he had Saul anointed as king. He was still God's king. He was still God's selection. But the purpose of the selection was entirely different. With Saul, the purpose was to fill the requests of the people. With this one, it was to fill the need of God. I am selecting, or I am providing myself a king. Now, Samuel's committed to fill his horn, and then he's to go to the house of Jesse, who was a Bethlehemite of the tribe of Judah, because God had provided himself a king. Now, I want you to notice something, that Abraham, and this carries us back a little ways. You'll remember when Pastor preached about it, when Abraham took Isaac up, and Isaac said, where is the sacrifice? I think, didn't Pastor mention that Sunday, or was it something else I was listening to?
Yeah, he did.
Anyway, and what did Abraham say? God will provide himself a sacrifice. And the sacrifice, of course, was the lamb that was caught in the thicket. So the lamb in the thicket was a foreshadow of what was to come. And that was, of course, Jesus Christ, who died on the cross. God says here, I'm providing myself a king. David was a foreshadow, or a type, of the king that was to come, the Messiah. And this is borne out all through Scripture. What is interesting, and we sometimes forget about it, we sing that song, "Oh, little town of Bethlehem," why? Because Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But so was David. David, the first king that God anointed for himself, was born in Bethlehem. The only other king for himself was the Messiah, Jesus. Both came from Bethlehem. And you know, remember we were sitting up on that hill looking over the rolling hills out of Bethlehem where the sheep, and you know how far you could see. Keep that in mind as we read through this. All right. So God tells him, go there. And Samuel, now this is an interesting thing to me. I sometimes, it's human nature, I understand. But here is Samuel. Now Samuel led Israel into victory after victory after victory. You remember the multitudes that were scattered, the armies, you know, because Samuel was there. He got them all together when he was acting as judge, and God would come down, you know, and they didn't even have to fight. You know, it was just over with. And here's now Samuel saying to God, now God said, I want you to go there. Now this is the same God that routed armies. And he says, well, I'm scared. Because what if Saul finds out? What?
Yeah.
What? But that's the same way as it was later with the prophet. Remember Elijah? He calls fire down out of heaven. You know, he single-handedly wipes out all the prophets of Baal. And then because Jezebel says, I'm going to come cut your head off, he runs and hides and gets in a cave and says, I can't do anything. Isn't that interesting? And we sometimes, you know, we just beat ourselves up because, man, I just don't have the faith for this. And, you know, and we beat ourselves up because we just don't completely rely on God. And yet here's two prophets of God who talked to God, who listened to God, who God used to do mighty miracles, and they're afraid of a human being. If they can do that, I mean, and God still works with them, he's going to still work with them.
Right.
You know, it just kind of blows my mind when I see Samuel. You know, I mean, he started talking to God when he was a kid. Knows God probably better than anybody in the Bible, except maybe Adam.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, when you think about it, he started as a little child talking to God. Nobody else did that. Moses was 40 when he finally learned about God. Abraham, we don't know how old he was, but he was old, had kids. So, you know, here is somebody who walks so long with God, you would think he would have absolute faith in whatever God said. But here he says, I don't know, God, what if Saul finds out? He'll kill me. You can defeat enemies, God. You can defeat armies. You can wipe out 100,000 of them out there. But, you know, I don't know if you can take care of Saul. I mean, he's a big guy. He's 6'5". You know, he's a big guy. I just kind of tickle when I read this part. But God had an answer for him. Now, some people, even some of the commentaries, they say, well, was God setting this up, you know, and having Samuel sort of lie about why he was going? No, not really, not at all. Because what God didn't say, you just tell him that I'm down there for a feast, I just happened to be coming by and thought or something like that. He said, no, you just take a heifer with you for a sacrifice, and you just tell him you're coming down to offer a sacrifice. Now remember what the offering and the sacrifice he was talking about here. It was the offering or the peace offering. You know, how many times have we talked about the peace offering? And associated with the peace offering was having the feast that went with it. It wasn't just killing the animal. It was a barbecue. So what he was saying is, I'm coming down for a cookout. We're going to have a barbecue. We're going to have a dinner. All the elders are invited to our dinner. Really, that's what it was. The only difference was the priest had to sacrifice make the preparations, and then they had a cook, and the cook cooked it. I mean, that's what it was. It's simple That was the first, we think we had barbecues the first one. No, no, no. They've been barbecuing since the days of Moses.
Yeah.
And that was not a lie. He went down there for the purpose of having a barbecue. And while he was having the barbecue, God said, you invite Jesse and his sons. And this gave Samuel the opportunity to look at all the sons.
Yeah.
All right? So, why is that clock off? I can't think. No, I just noticed it's not working. I got one. So anyway, here I thought I was doing so good, and then I looked at it again. I said, no, that's not right. So anyway, this was why he went down there. He went down. God said, I want you to go down there and anoint me one of the men of Jesse. But his reason for going was to have the offering of to give the peace offering. And that would be in line with what God did in selecting a king. Because the peace offering was offered, and as that was, feast was going on, that was the time when he would anoint a new king. So the two went together. You didn't just walk around and say, I think I'm going to come over here, I'm going to anoint you king. It was always done at the same time as a peace offering was given. Even you look at Saul, same thing. So the two go together. So it wasn't really being deceitful at all. It was just giving it two parts of what he was going to do when he was there. All right. So notice what happens. When Samuel arrived in Bethlehem, the leaders of the town came out to him. And this is interesting. They trembled at his coming and said, do you come peaceably? Now, I've mentioned before, when the prophets of God came to a town, they usually came with some kind of a warning. They didn't just show up to give them a little pat on the back usually. They showed up and said, hey, you got a problem, and here's what God is telling me to tell you. So there was that part of it. They weren't sure why he was there. Remember, he had a circuit. You remember Samuel had a circuit, and he went down through the middle part of Israel to the towns and hit those little towns and offered peace offerings usually and different things and ministered. Bethlehem wasn't on his circuit. He had to go out of his way to get to Bethlehem. And so when he showed up at Bethlehem, this was unusual. Why is Samuel here? Did we do something wrong? And it may be, did he find out what we've been doing wrong? That was probably more it than anything, you know. Also, there was the problem that they knew that Saul and Samuel were no longer friends. Samuel was no longer going with Saul to the battles. Samuel wasn't even talking to Saul. Now, you know everybody knew that, because the rumor mill was just as prevalent then as it is today. And so the servants, you know, they would tell each other, I haven't seen Samuel, man. Well, don't you know Samuel's not talking to Samuel? And I said, wow, you ought to tell my mom that. And, you know, so it got going. So everybody knew that these two weren't getting along. So was his coming to Bethlehem going to bring some kind of repercussion from Saul? So there were several things here that kind of played into why these elders, these leaders, were reluctant to have Samuel in town, or at least were questioning. And of course he puts them to ease and he says, no, I haven't come. No. He says, I've come peaceably. We're going to have a feast. I came to put on one of my famous barbecues in your town, and you're invited. Oh, that's okay then, yeah. We can go along with that. We like your barbecue. You bring pretty good meat to town, you know, that's a barbecue. So, another thing to remember, that the elders understood the power that Samuel possessed. If they weren't afraid of the power of Samuel, they would not have been afraid. They knew when Samuel showed up, he didn't show up just as an old man walking around, because he was up in age now. He showed up with all the power and authority of God. And he demonstrated that on several occasions prior to this. So we know he had that. All right. So let's move on. Oh, here's what Samuel did. First of all, he instructed the elders to sanctify themselves. And you find that kind of sanctification in Exodus chapter 19, verses 14 and 15. There were some things they were supposed to do and not supposed to do prior to the feast. And so sanctify themselves, mainly wash their clothes, and then don't have any relationships with your wives. That was kind of for that 2 or 3 days prior to the feast. So Samuel comes to town. He tells the elders, you need to sanctify yourself because we're going to have this peace offering. And so everybody had to be sanctified for that. Now he does something interesting. It says, then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So at some point he went to Jesse's house, evidently, and told Jesse, look, I'm inviting you to the peace offering, to my barbecue, and you need to sanctify yourself. So he went over with them what they needed to do to make sure they were sanctified, him and his sons. And so he took special care to make sure that all the house of Jesse was in a position to be selected by God. If they had showed up and they hadn't sanctified themselves, God would not select anybody out of that house and probably maybe even bring some judgment on them. So it was important. All right, verses 6 and 7. So it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. We've probably heard this preached how many times over the years? But it is still true. It's not the outward appearance that God is after. Remember when they selected King Saul, it was because he was 6'5", he was a big man, he looked the part, he was a foot higher than everybody else. When he went into battle, they could see his head over everybody else's. This is the man that's going to bring victory to Israel because look at him. And evidently from the wording here, that Jesse's oldest son, Eliab, may have been very similar in physique. Now, he wasn't as tall, I'm sure, as Saul at 6'5", but he was probably a big man, robust, big guy. And we'll learn later he was a soldier. He would have been the guy. Oh yeah, this must be the one. Must be the one. But God says, no. No. I don't want him. Now this, by the way, may have been part of the sanctification that Jesse was going through, or that Samuel was going through with Jesse and his boys. Make sure they're sanctified. He didn't tell Jesse, and I want you to notice, he never told Jesse, hey, I am looking for the next king. He never said that. You don't find that any place. And from what goes on later, it's pretty apparent Jesse had no idea what was really going on here, nor his sons. And what Samuel was doing, he was probably bringing each one of them, checking them out to make sure they're sanctified. He didn't do it with the elders, did it with Jesse and his kids. So then what did he do? Well, let's see, where am I? One thing to always remember, that we don't always understand the designs of God. We think we know what God wants, but we never know what God really wants. Samuel was thinking God wants a king like we've had, but one that'll follow him. God was thinking, I don't want that kind of a king. I don't want a guy 6'5" and towers over everybody. I don't want, that's not the kind of king that I'm after. I'm after a king that will listen to me and do what I want to do. And I'll bring the victories. I don't want somebody who's going to go off on their own. All right? Let's move on. Verses 8. So Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. Now he didn't say chosen to be what? He just said the Lord hasn't chosen these. Now whether that means he hadn't chosen them to go to the feast, whatever it was, God had not chosen any of the 7. And Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? Then he said, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. Now you remember looking out over those rolling hills. And this feast was probably being held on one of the high hills right by Bethlehem. That's where they usually had their peace offerings. And I'm sure that Samuel and Jesse were standing there, the boys were passing by, and they could look out over the hills. And then Jesse says, well, yeah, I have you see those sheep right over there? You see them out there? Those little white patch, that sheep? That's my youngest son. That's David. He's just the youngest boy, and he's tending the sheep out there. You can see for what, 1.5 miles, 2 miles out there on those hills? So no telling how far out he was with those sheep. But Samuel says, you go get him. Send somebody after him. Because we're not going to sit down to the barbecue until he's here. We're holding dinner. We're not going to sit down. He has to be here. Well, there's a sermon on that one. All right, verse 12. I got to be careful. I'll be off all night here. So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah, or Ramah. Now, not being fully familiar with all of the steps of their peace offering and everything they did, why he anointed David without them understanding he was being anointed, I don't know. I'm sure there was a reason why he was selected, and they probably did not understand the reasoning for that selection. But it was done in the midst of his brothers. So they all understood that there was something special about David. I don't think they understood what that was. Let me open a window here.
Yeah, it's one.
It's getting hot in here.
Yeah.
All right, get some air. All right, so it wasn't something he did over. He didn't say, Jesse and David, come over here to the side someplace. He did it in the midst of the family. It doesn't say the elders were there or anybody else. It was private to the family. All right. Now, after he had anointed David, the scripture doesn't talk about it, but I'm sure they went ahead with the peace offering, and they had the barbecue, and they had the dinner and the feast with all the elders. He went through all of that. And then he went back to Ramah. Now there's some things to notice about David. Number one, he was ruddy. Now this could either mean he had red hair or he had red skin. Kind of a reddish hue to his skin. Also, there's some other things that he talks about with David. He had bright eyes. Now, I haven't figured out what that means. No commentary tries to figure that one out as to what he meant by bright eyes. We always say a kid is bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. One of these kids. Whoa.
Maybe he had blue eyes. Maybe he had blue eyes.
Maybe he had blue eyes. I don't know. Maybe that made him bright eyes. The blue eyes.
If he had red hair, he probably had blue eyes.
That's very possible. That's a good point. Good point. So maybe that's what they were trying to say, red-haired and bright-eyed. I don't know. We don't know. But I think about Christian, I mean, that boy wore me out Sunday morning before church. I was just sitting watching him, and I was wore out. I mean, that kid didn't stop a second. He was bouncing, maybe it was something like that. David, let's go, let's go. And he was good-looking. He's a good-looking young man. God said, that's the one I want. Now, there's a lot of talk about how old David was at this time. Josephus puts his age at 10. A lot of the Bible scholars give him about 15. But at either end of that, he was between 10 and 12 years old. So he wasn't very old or very big. Notice it doesn't say anything about his physique, his being, muscular. He was just red hair, blue eyes, or red skin and bright eyes, or however you want to look at it, and handsome, and that's all it tells you. And that was David. But notice what happens. Samuel did not need to make a proclamation or indicate why he anointed David. God does not need our proclamations to fulfill his intentions.
Right.
We sometimes, we think we have to make some kind of a proclamation, or we have to have some kind of a special service or special something before God will anoint someone. Remember, we used to have anointing services, we're going to have a special service, and if you want to be anointed of God, you come down, we're going to lay hands on you and God will anoint you. Well, that didn't always work. In fact, seldom worked. God doesn't anoint people based on what we think they should do, or, it's based on that person. That person has to be put in that position, and then God will anoint them. Notice, this was a sanctification situation. So Samuel, he made sure they were sanctified, and when David came before him, God said, that's the one that I'm anointing. Now Samuel did the outward anointing, but it was God that did the inward anointing. Because it said, when Samuel anointed when Samuel anointed David, what happened? It said the Spirit of God came on David, just as it had come on Saul. He was now operating under the Spirit. Now, 10 years old? Yep. God is no respecter of persons. You remember, Jesus was 12. Of course, he was God, but that was still age of accountability, and he was teaching the rabbis, So God can use any age group. He can even use a donkey. All right. Now, this was the same Spirit that came on Samson and the rest of the judges, as well as on Saul. And we find this 1 Samuel 10 and 6, Judges 3 and 10, Judges 6:34, 11:29, 14:19, 15:14. Every one of the judges who had the Spirit of God move on them, it was the same Spirit of God. Now, why is it important to understand that? Because the judges were the ones who delivered Israel, and they did it by the power of God. Yeah. So the same power that Saul had was now on David. And we'll see how that plays out here in a little bit. All right, now, we go to verse 14. And this brings up an interesting thing here. Verse 14, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servants said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let our master now command your servants, who are before you, to seek out a man who is a skillful player of the harp. And it shall be that he will play it with his hand when the distressing spirit from God is upon you, and you shall be well. So Saul said to his servants, provide me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me. So when the Spirit of God rested on David, it lifted from Saul. The Spirit of God to anoint a king can't be on two kings at the same time. Now, unlike today, he could only, if Saul was anointed and had the power of God to be king, then David couldn't have the same thing. Mm-hmm. So God had to lift the power from Saul and put it on David. So now David had the same power that Saul had. Now, we want to know what that is. Let's go back and look at Saul. What happened when the Spirit of God came on Saul? He was able to prophesy. He was able to miraculously deliver Israel in battles and different things. It said, we read that thing. It says, for the rest of Saul's life, he delivered Israel from the hands of the Philistines, the Amorites, the Amalekites. And all these lists, all of them. Saul was able to bring victory to the camp of Israel. That same Spirit is now on this little boy named David. But when the Spirit of God lifted, then God sent another spirit. Now, there's been a lot of controversy. Does God send evil spirits? Yeah. I guess the best answer is yes. We say, well, God, Satan is the one who controls all these evil spirits, and that's very true. But you've got to remember, God still holds a position much higher than Satan.
Yeah.
And probably in the actual, if you could project ourselves into the realm of the supernatural, and we could sit and watch things, and probably what God merely did is to tell Satan, okay, you can send a spirit onto him now, just as he did to Job. Mm-hmm. Satan wants to send spirits on all of us, so that's nothing new. He wants to do that. And God just said, okay, you can put one on Saul now. And this spirit, evidently, when it came on Saul, was, today, I don't know what we'd call it. There's so many terms they use for things. Would it be bipolar, deep depression, type thing? Yeah. And from the looks of how it's described, I would say he was bipolar, and there were times when he just go into deep depression, and and he's ready to kill him or anybody, and he's just, these kind of guys. And so when that happened, everybody had to scatter. And the servants, when he come out of that, he would be normal. And so one of them said, listen, you need somebody to play the music, because this has always been from time and immortal, not immortal. Anyway, for a long time, it's been felt that music will soothe, and it's proven to be correct. It'll even soothe plants. They've proven you can play music to plants, and you play rock music, and they die. What happens if they put contemporary Christian on it? Let's try that. Anyway, bias is coming through. But anyway, they've known that music is a relaxing way of calming people. And so they suggested, let's go find somebody who's really a good musician, and they can play for you. And maybe that'll make it better. And so Saul agreed. He says, okay, go find me somebody. So, let's read on. Verses 18. Then one of the servants answered and said, look, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skilled in playing. Notice this. A mighty man of valor. A man of war. Prudent in speech. And a handsome person. And the Lord is with him. Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who was with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread and a skin of wine and a young goat and sent them by his son David to Saul. So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. Now this is where we kind of kick a lot of the teachings that we, yes.
So he must have been quite a bit older now.
Now you see, you're jumping ahead of me.
I'm sorry.
This is where we kick a lot of these assumptions that we've been taught for years, you know. You see Saul calling for David, and David comes in, milky skin, you know, and a little guy, and he comes in and sits down and plays his harp. No. How long this had been, we don't know. But suddenly the 10-year-old is now talked about as, look at this, I mean, he is a skillful musician. Mm-hmm. Skillful. You don't get skillful as a 10-year-old. Well, you could be, I suppose, if you were a protege or one of these genius kids, you know, there's a lot of them are out there. But that wasn't really what David was. He was skilled with the harp. He probably sat out there and played harps, and the way he wrote the Psalms and some of the stuff, he probably sat out there with the sheep and he strummed and he, you know, the Spirit of God was on him. Mm-hmm. Music changes when the Spirit of God is there. Pastor and I were talking about this after service Sunday. You know, we want to worship, but it's the music that puts us in a position to worship. And when the Spirit of God comes, that music changes. It takes on a whole different dimension. It could be the same song, but it takes on a different dimension. And David was skilled in music. Notice what else it says here. Now, he was a skillful fighter. Now that's a paradox. You don't find musicians who are usually good fighters. You're either a musician or a fighter. You're very seldom both. Usually to be a good musician, you almost have to be a little effeminate. Yeah. I think that's right. Anyway. Me and words don't always get along. But you know, because that's the artful side, you know, your brain is in two pieces, you know, and anyway, if your one side is really strong, you're going to be strong in music, but it's the other side that makes you a fighter. And so, that's what they tell me anyway. I've never looked at one, so I don't know. But, you know, that's what they tell me. So, it's very seldom that you find somebody who is a great musician and a strong fighter. Notice what else it says about him. He was eloquent in speech. He was somebody who could orate. He could get up and talk. He could use the Hebrew language correctly. Something I wish I could do sometimes. But, you know, not Hebrew, I'd rather use English. But, you know, he could speak. He could, and probably because he was eloquent in his speaking, he could probably very well educated or literate. And he was handsome. And he was fearless. Now, how did this guy know all of this? And where did David learn all of this? We don't know. You know, just looking at this, we don't really know. But from what we know about history, it was probably that David was in the army for Judah, because each tribe had their own army. And when King Saul called the armies together, Judah would send their army, but it was Judah who trained the men. It was Judah who put them in their positions of, you know, leadership. Those kinds of things. And Abner, who was Saul's captain, he just called all the armies. He was over all of them, but they all had their own captains and their own leaders, you know. And so David was probably in the army. We know his 3 older brothers were. We'll find out about that later. What's interesting, we never find out about the other 4. Never mentioned. We don't know what they did. We don't know if they did anything. Maybe they were all laying around. I don't know. Maybe they were town drunks. I mean, we don't know. We just don't know. You know. But here we see that David already had a reputation of being more than just a teenage harp player. Now, he was probably a teenager at this time, probably in his late teens perhaps, maybe mid-teens. But he already had this reputation. Amazing to me when I look at this. Now, so what did Saul do? He says, all right, I've heard about this guy. He sends a messenger to Jesse and he says, send this boy over because I need him. He conscripted him into the army. Now, I don't know what kind of constitution that they were operating under, but it was quite possible that Saul could only call men up into the army. In other words, he couldn't call somebody to be his personal valet. He could hire somebody, because that would be in the position of a slave. And under the law of Moses, you couldn't bring a Levite, an Israelite, and make him a slave unless he owed you money or, there was a reason. So he probably conscripted David to come into the army. And that's why he was called an armor bearer. Saul did not have one armor bearer. He would call whoever he wanted, but he was one that Saul would call as an armor bearer if he wanted to. So that's why we don't see David as actually being an armor bearer anywhere. It was how he was probably called into the army. So Saul calls for him. Jesse sends him over. He takes a donkey. Well, a lot of donkeys in 1 Samuel. He loads it down with all these gifts for Saul, which was their custom, and he sends him off to meet with Saul. Now, it's interesting, how many today, if the government called and said, I want your boy, you're going to say, okay, I'll say, oh, let me give you all kinds of presents for taking this boy. Now, there were times when I would have offered anybody anything to take one of my kids. There are those times, hey, you want my car, take it too. You feel that way sometimes. But Jesse wanted to honor the position of king. He understood that Saul was king under God, so he was presenting and honoring Saul by these gifts. And when David came to Saul and stood before him, it says he loved him greatly. In other words, he said, wow, look at this boy. And he probably played for him, and he probably said, wow, yeah, this is the guy I want. This is the one I want. All right, let's move on. Then Saul, verse 24. That's chapter 16, by the way. And it's verse 22, not 24. Verse 22. Then Saul sent to Jesse, saying, please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. And so it was, whenever the Spirit of God was upon Saul, that David would take a spirit from God, this would be the troubling spirit, was on Saul. David would take a harp and play it with his hand. Then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him. So what would happen is David would go home, and what Saul was asking Jesse here is, when I need him, please send him back. And notice it's a request. It's not a conscription. So David was allowed to go home, and anytime the spirit, this troubling evil spirit, would come on Saul, they'd send for David. He would make a beeline for Gabaa, and he would play his harp for David, or for Saul. And when Saul calmed down, the evil spirit would leave, and David would head home. Now, one thing to note here: it wasn't the music. It wasn't the music that drove the spirit from Saul. The music didn't do it. The music had a calming effect, yes. But what did it is the presence of God that was on David. David had the power of God. Where the power of God is, where his presence is, demons, spirits, evil cannot stay. They cannot be in the same room, in the same area as the power of God. This is what Pastor has been preaching about, and over the last several weeks. We need to get back to that place to where we have so much power that the evil cannot stand in our presence. Not because of us, but because of his power. When we get that power, then things change. We cannot change anything. Only the power of God. All right, let's move into 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning with verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Shochoh, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Shochoh and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. All right? And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. If you go to your next to the last page, yes. Last page. Go to the last page. There's a picture of the valley of Elah. And it hasn't changed much from the days of David. There are some villages there. This ruins that's there, they've been digging in this ruins, was actually one of the cities from David's day. It was a fortress that was built to overlook this valley. And you're standing in the middle of it here from this picture. But if you look up that valley, the Philistines would have been on that hill on the right-hand side. Yeah, the green hill on the right-hand side, the other right. And Saul and his army were on the left-hand side, on the hill on the left. So you can kind of get a picture of how big this valley is. It's only a half a mile across. So it's not a huge place. All right. And a champion, verse 4, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of maul, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? I am not a Philistine. Am I not a Philistine? And you, the servants of Saul, choose a man of yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So, the picture. The Philistines once again got their armies together. We don't know who was leading this army now, but they got all of the areas that the Philistines possessed. All of them had their own little armies or clans. They got them all together, and they lined them up on the hill overlooking this valley. Now, we don't know why they went to battle. Before it was because of Jonathan. You remember last week, Jonathan went up, and that caused him to cut the boundary down, the boundary marker, and that caused him to come and want to fight. We don't know what happened this time. But we do know that they had this champion named Goliath. Now, in the 19th century, Conder and Kishner described the Elah Valley as being one of the most fertile districts in Palestine. This is in the 1800s. It is an open, flat vale about 1.5 miles across and covered with corn. A narrow trench runs down the center full of white pebbles worn by the water in winter. Here and there large terebinths grow along its course, and solitary oak trees on either side rise the stony cliffs covered with brushwood and wild growth. And you look at that picture and it's pretty much the same. The one thing you can't see is that little trench that goes down the middle. That's an important little trench. All right. Now Goliath, he was their champion. He was from the city of Gath, which is one of the 5 major Philistine cities. That was one of the 3 towns that, well, first of all, before I get there, Goliath stood 6 cubits in a span tall, and he had 4 brothers that were also giants. Now, I did some calculating at home. A cubit was measured from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, or about 1.5 feet. So obviously their measuring system had a little bit to be desired when it came to being the same for everybody. But I measured mine and it came out pretty close to what it is. The span was the distance between the thumb and the little finger when you spread your hand out like this. Like that. It's about 9 inches. 8 to 9 inches, depending. So when you put that together, Goliath was about 9 feet 6 inches tall.
Wow. Wow.
So he was a pretty big boy. Saul was 6'5".
9 feet.
So, you know, Goliath was over 3 feet taller than Saul.
He was how?
Big man.
9 foot.
Big man.
9 foot what?
6.
9'6".
I'm sorry, the question?
9 foot 6.
9 foot 6. Now, he was a giant. Now, a giant, in those days, the term for giant was that he was a Raphaim. A Raphaim was a leftover from the time when the sons of God met with the women of man. In other words, it was those angels that left their first estate. They're now locked in a special place, and they will be chained there until the end of time, when they will go into the lake of fire with the devil and all the rest of those fallen angels. But they are not part of the fallen angels that we fight about today. They're chained up in a place called Tarshish. Now, this is a lot of speculation, but there's also a lot of scientific research that backs it up, is that when the angels met with women, the result were giants. And you remember when the spies came into the promised land, what did they say? They're giants. We can't do anything. Well, Goliath was one of the remaining Rephaim, and there were giants in 3 of the Philistine cities. Gaza, Ashdod were the other 2 cities. So it was Gath, it was Gaza, and Ashdod that had giants at the time of this story. Now, there may have been some others, but these are the ones that predominantly we know there were giants there. It's interesting, I was looking on web, just looking around today, they have uncovered the cemetery at Gath. And they pulled 2, it's the only one they've ever found skeletons in. The Philistines, they've never been able to prove there were actually Philistines, which is interesting. And they have now figured out that they were the sea people that's referred to by Egypt, because Egypt was at war with the sea people all the time. Well, these were the Philistines that were on the coast. Well, they now uncovered the Philistine cemetery. So they've proven there were Philistines, who they were, and they're still in the process of doing DNA testing and all that kind of stuff to figure out where they came from. They think they may have come from the island of Crete at some point, but that's here nor there. But at some point, the giants were filtered in among the Philistines. Now Goliath wore a brass helmet and a quart of mall that weighed 5,000 shekels. When you figure that out, someplace between 105 and 115 pounds was his. That was just his coat of mall that covered the front and the back and was usually down to about his waist. He had armor on his legs that covered from the tops of his sandals, and in fact they actually had a metal boot that went over the top of the feet, and it was up around the knee area, and it was strapped on. And he had a javelin. Now the javelin wasn't like we think of javelin throwing, it was a short sword or a dagger that was between his shoulder blades. And you see some of the movies, and these guys will come out and they got the leather thing and the handle sticking up in the air, and they can pull it out. That's exactly what the Bible says he had. Now the helmet that they wore was like a tiara. It went around as a band that went around, and it had metal. In fact, they actually referred to them as feathers, but they looked like feathers, but they were brass pieces that stuck straight up in the air this way. And you'll see these in a lot of the statues and the archaeological things. You'll see this band, they got this thing sticking up on their head. And then from that, there was a maul, that was brass that was hooked together like chains, sort of, that hung down from that and covered the back part of their neck. So you couldn't get them from the back. So that's the way he was dressed. Now he had in his hand a spear. And the tip of that spear was iron, and it weighed, where was I? Lost it here. The spear was about the size of a weaver's beam, or about 10 feet long. And I don't have the weight. Where did I lose the weight? Someplace. I had it in here. Anyway, it was heavy.
17 and 18 pounds.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing it on here. I don't know whether I had some problems and I had to redo my notes, and I may have missed it. But that's about right, 17 to 18 pounds. And the metal that he wore, they call it fish scales. It was pieces of brass that were welded or like riveted together that looked like fish scales, so they overhung each other and it allowed them to move. Right. So that's what they wore. Now every day Goliath would come down to the valley and challenge anyone from the army of the Israelites to come and fight with him. If he won, Israel would be the servants of the Philistines, and that would end the conflict. If the champion from Israel won, then the Philistines would be the servants of Israel, and that would end the conflict. Of course, you can trust these guys just about as much as you can trust. Anyway, we know David won, but it didn't end the conflict. David constantly was at war with the Philistines. So, the words were hollow, very hollow. And the idea was the two champions would fight, and whoever won would take over the other country. Now every time Saul came down and challenged, all the soldiers in Israel were trembling. King Saul. They were afraid. It shook them up. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Remember, Samuel was no longer on the scene.
Yeah.
If Samuel had been there, what do you think he would have done? Who knows? It depends on what God told him to do, obviously. But I can see Samuel walking out onto the battlefield, pointing a finger and say, "You're done." Boom, you're gone. But Samuel wasn't there. All right, verse 12. Now David was the son of the Ephraelite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons, and the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. So we know now that Jesse was getting old. He was up there. Which tells us that the sons were now getting up there. They were middle-aged. Probably the oldest son would have been in his 40s, maybe 50s, you know. David, he's probably now someplace in his early 20s. All right, so he's grown considerably. The three oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to battle. So they were in the army of Judah, and they had gone to fight with Saul in his army. The names of his three sons who went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the three oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistines drew near and presented himself, the Philistine, Goliath, presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. So twice a day, morning and evening, here this guy would walk out from the camp of the Philistines and down the hill with his armor bearer in front of the shield, and he would go out and challenge the armies of Israel. Then Jesse said to his son David, "Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their thousands, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them." Now Saul and all of the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. Now, this is kind of interesting, and let's pause here for a minute. So, here we have David, he's home with Jesse. And this was one of the times when David was not needed by King Saul. How long this has been, we don't know. And we know at least 40 days, because there have been battle. But it may have been years since Saul had called for David. Evidently, it was a pretty prolonged period of time, as we'll find out in a minute. And on this particular day, Jesse, he called in David, and he said, "I want you to go down to the battle, and I want you to check with your sons. With your brothers. Talk to them, see how they're doing, and then come back and let me know how they are and how the battle is going, all kinds of things." And he said, "What I want you to do is take this food." Now, he had, he was bringing back some dried grain. Now this is interesting, the Bible calls it corn. But actually it was not corn. Corn was not native to that land. They didn't have ears of corn until after the Spaniards brought corn from South America and from America. Corn is actually native to here. So they didn't have corn cobs like we think about it. It was grain. Probably wheat or barley, could have been rye. They had the grains, but they didn't have corn. And what they would do, they would dry the grain out, and then they would put it in a bowl, and they would pour either water or milk or oil on it, and they would eat it like a cereal. And so what he was doing was he was providing for his three sons. Somebody had to send food for the army, right? Mm-hmm. And so this was Jesse's part in sending food for the army. So he was sending the dried grain and loaves of bread, and he was sending cheese, big blocks of cheese, to be used by the army. Notice he said, take these things, and I want you to give those, wherever I am here, give these to the captain of their 1,000. Well, actually it was the keeper, the food keeper, or the store, what do we call them today, sergeant, storeroom sergeant, they have a name for them anyway. who took care of this stuff. So it was the guy who was responsible for storing all the food and making sure everybody got fed. All right, so that's what's going on. And so Jesse says, all right, I want you to take these down. And it says here, now Saul and the men that were with him were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. Well, actually, they weren't fighting. But Jesse didn't know that. He knew that from this perspective, there was a battle going on. Actually, they had the battle lines, they were all drawn up, they were ready to fight, but nobody was fighting because Goliath kept coming out asking for a champion to fight. Now, they had to be ready to fight. In case one or the other decided to charge, you better have your men out there and be ready. So every morning, you can see the soldiers would all get ready. And this seems strange, but if you read the history of the Civil War, this is exactly what they did in the days of Civil War. They would all get and they'd line all up, and it was kind of like a football game. They kind of all lined up, and when the sun came up, kind of almost at an appointed time, each of the armies would come out, and they'd start fighting, and then when the sun went down, they'd go back home, or back to their tents. That's the way they fought in those days. That was kind of it. So there was an appointed time, kind of, when they lined up and went to battle. Kind of strange. To me, I'd go in the middle of the night and wipe them out when they were in bed, but that wasn't the way they did things in those days. They had their own rules. And so here they were, ready to go to fight, because Israel had drawn the battle lines, and so had the Philistines. So they were lined up to fight, but they weren't really fighting. Verse 22, and David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. So he runs down and he finds his brothers there in the army. Then he talked with them. Then as he talked to them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. David heard them. That's kind of important. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. So these guys are talking amongst themselves. And David is standing there talking to his brothers. And he sees this giant come out, and he hears what he's saying, and he hears the comments of these other soldiers. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Did I hear you right? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Goliath referred to the armies of Saul. David refers to the armies of the living God.
Yeah.
You see, Saul, he was in his own little thing. I'm a big man, but I can't take this guy on.
Right.
I don't have any resources. My army's not big enough. We're in danger here. We're in a position we can't do anything. And here comes David, who says, who is this uncircumcised, vile person who dares to defy the armies of the living God? To David, his view was not that Philistine army, this 9'6" giant who is defying this other army on this side. To David, it was this despicable human being who dared defy the armies of the living God. You remember, it says in the Bible that if Jesus wanted to, he could have called 10,000 angels. Goliath was not just out here taunting some human beings out here. He was taunting the living God and his army, which includes all the heavenlies.
Yeah.
Remember when the servant of Elijah was all distraught. You know, they were out there and the enemy was surrounded them and they were going to be defeated. And this poor servant, he's talking to Elijah, Elijah, we're going to die. And Elijah, he's sitting, he has a big armchair and he's got a big cup of iced tea and he's sitting back and he's just enjoying the day. And the servant's getting wild with frustration because Elijah's not responding. And Elijah just says, God, open his eyes. And they were surrounded by an army that they couldn't even number that was on his side. You see, David was looking not at the present circumstances that we see. He looked beyond that veil of humanity into the spirit world and said, this man doesn't even know what he's doing. And it's surprised he didn't add in, what is this stupid guy doing? He doesn't know what's going to happen to him. See? That was David. That's why God said he had selected a man after his own heart. You remember last week? God said, I have already selected the one I want. At that time, he was probably just a very young boy. But I've selected him because he's a man after my heart. He knows what I want. He knows how I think. He knows how I see. So David turns over and he says, did I hear you right? If I defeat this guy, this is what David is saying, and they understood it. If I defeat this guy, then I'm going to get to marry the king's daughter. Michal, king's daughter. Wow. He says, yeah. I'm going to have riches. And my father, Jesse, won't have to pay any more taxes. And actually, that probably means he would not have to have anybody from his house conscripted again into the army, or as for the king's use. Wow. The people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be to the man who kills him. All right. Israel wanted a visible king to fight for them. But David saw the invisible king that would fight for them. The visible king was not able to bring the victory, but the invisible king was. Verse 28, now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why do you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? That's the way I read it anyway. What have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. Now Eliab, he became enraged when he heard David. What does this sound like? Remember the story of Joseph? When Joseph told his dad his visions that he had and his dreams, what did the brothers do?
Yeah, got mad.
Oh, they were mad. They were mad enough they threw him in a pit. They sold him down to Egypt and they wanted to kill him.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, yeah. They were jealous. They were upset. How could this boy possibly, he's rude. He doesn't realize the hierarchy of the family. Huh. It also may have been that they understood that Eliab, I'm going to give him the the doubt here. He may have feared that David would do something foolish like fighting Goliath. You know, he understood God's blessing was on him. He understood he'd been anointed for something special. And maybe he was afraid that he was going to ruin it all. And after all, what would his dad do if something happened to David? So there was two things. It was probably playing in the mind of Eliab. But notice David's response. What did I do now? I can seem to say, you know, this tells me that probably Eliab was on him all the time. You know, he was one of those older brothers that said, yeah, Sam, go over here, do that now. What have I done now? And then he turns around and gives probably one of the most quoted pieces in the Bible, and that is there not a cause? Isn't there a reason for me to be here? You accuse me of just wanting to come down and watch the battle. But is there not a cause that I should be here?
That's right.
And he turned around to the other soldiers and he said, is there not a cause? Is there not a cause? Hey, is there not a cause? You see, it wasn't that David wanted to make his brother look bad. He wanted Israel to understand that he was there because there was a cause. He wasn't looking at it like, I don't know, 22, 23 years old. I'm a pretty good fighter and I've killed these animals and I'm really good, you know, and I'm down here to take it on because you guys are a bunch of scaredy cats. But he was looking at it and saying, God is with me. And if God is with me, nothing can stop me. Is there not a cause why I shouldn't go out there and defeat and kill and cut the head off of this uncircumcised Philistine? It was kind of like Jonathan. You know? If you want me to go out there to battle, no. I'm going out to battle and God, you're going to have to stop me. That was his attitude. I've got the power. I've got the spirit. I'm going out and I'm going to defeat that ugly looking thing out there. I don't care how big he is. I don't care how many are in his army. I don't care how many armor bearers he's got. He can be covered from head to toe and looking out a little slit. But in the power of God, I am going to defeat him. No questions asked. Wow. If we can only get that kind of spirit. I wish I had that kind of spirit. I wish I was 30 years younger and had that kind of spirit. All right, verse 31. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistines. Saul, tell your men not to be afraid. Tell them to quit hiding, quit running away from this guy, because your servant, that's me, I am your servant. I am going out to fight with this Philistine. Talk about confidence. Talk about faith. Talk about knowing who you are. Talk about knowing who is with you. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose to me, I caught it by the beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defiled the armies of the living God.
Yeah.
Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Now this tells me something about David. This tells me David wasn't just a little boy sitting out playing a harp in the shepherd's field and, along came a lion and no. He was a skilled fighter. He had determination and he wasn't afraid of anything. That lion came at him, took a lamb, he just chased it down. He grabbed the lion, pulled the lamb out of the lion's mouth, set it on the ground and turned around, grabbed the lion by his beard and began to beat it to death. And then there was a bear. Well, he took the bear the same way. Didn't matter to him. The bears over there were brown bears, and they were large brown bears. This wasn't some little paper cub, a little cub that happened to come by. He grabbed that bear, and when he got through with that bear, it was good meat for the rest of the camp.
Yeah.
You see? He had something in him that said there is nothing too big for me to do. Why? Because I have the Spirit of God. That was the key. He didn't tell Saul, look, I'm really good because look at my size. I'm masculine. I'm big. Saul was bigger. He didn't look at Saul and say, well, I've done all of these things, and so you should know I'm really good. No. He went on to say that the same God that delivered me from the lion and delivered me from this bear is going to deliver me from this uncircumcised Philistine who has defied the armies of God. He not only said and attested to the fact that God would do it, but he also gave the reasons why. Because he defied the armies of the living God. Oh. Saul recognized something in David. And maybe there was a flashback in his mind. Maybe he remembered when he had the power of God. Maybe he remembered what it was like to see through the eyes of God. And so he told David, you go ahead. Because the reason David was there to seek permission. He said he was the servant of Saul. If Saul had said no, would David have gone to battle? I don't think so. I don't think so. But I think David would have been very much afraid for Saul. Because Saul would have then been defying the will of God. All right. Saul tells him, you're just but a youth. You're not very big. You're not very old. You just don't have the experience. All right, verse 38. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor, and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Here's Saul doing what he could to protect David. I'll give you some of my personal armor. Well, he probably had several sets of armor and different types of armor. You know, in those days it was depending on what the battle was. But he put a bronze helmet on David's head. I can see David moving his head and the helmet's flopping all over. Yeah. I mean, nobody was as big as Saul. He put the coat of maul on. He was a foot taller than David, so that meant he was hanging clear down almost to his knees. And he put the leg armor on, and it's coming up way past his knees. And David's trying to walk around, you know. You can imagine trying to walk in that stuff. It's heavy, you know, and it doesn't fit him. It's not tested, it's not fit. It's not his armor. And he said, I can't go to battle like this. I wouldn't even be able to walk out there. How do you expect me to do anything? You know. So he took off the armor, gave it back to Saul. Verse 40. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David. And when the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Now notice this. Goliath has come down off of the mountain, and he's standing in the valley on his side. David comes down from the other side. And he starts out across the valley. And he comes to that little trench in the middle of the valley. What was in the trench? Smooth stones that had been worn by the water. And David bends down and he selects 5 of those smooth stones. And he put them in the little bag that the shepherds carried, where they usually carried their food. Put the 5 stones in there. Now all David had with him was a staff and a sling. Now the slingshots were not a slingshot. It wasn't one of these things, you pull like that. It was a leather strip about so long with 2 holes in it, and they tied leather or rope to it. And so it was like this. They would tie either around their finger or around their wrist. They would tie one end of it, and they would hang on to the other. They'd put a rock in it and give it a sling and let go. And you wonder, how in the world could they hit anything with that? I was watching a video. I almost watched it too long. I almost ran out of time. I was so intrigued. This guy was standing out there with a target about from here to the, I don't know, maybe not quite to the door down there, with a slingshot. And he's standing there, one after the other, boom, bullseye. One after the other, bullseye, bullseye. I mean, he was about, and he put it right through the plywood. They say one of these slings like this, if it's handled by an expert, has the same killing power as a .44 caliber
Wow,
gun.
that's powerful.
They said if it hits you in the head, it'll kill you. Period. That's the statement. However, I also watched this video for a bit, and I found something I had never heard, and so I did a little research, and it probably is very true. David did not use that kind of a slingshot. Well, it was, but it was a little different, because he had the staff. What they would do is they would take one end of the slingshot and they would tie it tightly to the staff. The other end, they would put a loop on it and just hang it over the tip of the staff. And they would take this staff, put a rock in it, and they would just sling it like that. On the end of that pole, by the time it released, it could carry stones about this big around. And they were showing one of those. They took and hit they took a coconut and put it inside a gel, big gel thing. And they were shooting slingshots and stuff at it, and it couldn't get into the coconut. He hit it with a rock off of that thing. It went through, split that coconut wide open. He put it right through the plywood. They were trying to see how fast it was entering. The highest he got was like 109 miles an hour when it hit the plywood. And it was probably this kind of a sling that David used. It's what the shepherds used on larger animals. If they had a bear, they put it on that thing, give it a sling like that, and they hit that bear, and that was the end of the bear. And so it was probably that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have the staff, because it takes 2 hands to do the sling. It takes one to sling it and one to put the rock in it, and you'd have to lay the staff down. You can't hang on to it, and it doesn't work. Either way, whatever it was, that's all David had. And when he came to the Philistine, and I can see David jumping over that brook, that little trench that went down the middle of the canyon. He jumped over and he's headed for the Philistine. And the Philistine looks at him and he said, "Am I a dog? Really? You're going to come out here with that stick like I'm a dog? Look at me. I'm 9 feet 6 inches tall. You can't even reach me with that stick." What are you going to do with it? All right. And I know something's kind of funny to me too. Goliath's walking around with all of this stuff and he has an armor bearer in front of him with his shield. I don't know. Put it behind you if you're really a man. You know, why do you have to hide behind a shield? Anyway, I'm past time. Gotta go. All right. 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you, and this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into my hands." Notice Goliath said, "I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David countered and said, "I'm going to take your head off. I'm going to take your head off and all the camp of the Philistines. All those soldiers up behind you. They're going to be food for the birds of the air and for the wild beasts. We're going to destroy the whole army, and we're going to feed the birds, and we're going to..." See, they were really into this green thing. He was really into this environmentalist thing. You know, they're going to take care of the animals. Never mind. All right. All right. Notice how he was going to do this. He was going to do it through the power of the God of the armies of Israel. He wasn't doing it through his own. He wasn't going to do it because he was an expert marksman with his sling. He was going to do it because God enabled him to do it. And the reason was twofold. One was so that the earth, everybody, would know that there is a God in Israel. You don't want to mess with Israel, because there is a God, a powerful God, a God who will defeat you, who will wipe you out, and he's the God of Israel. And then for the assembly, the army behind him that was standing there, he said that this assembly shall know that God does not save with sword and spear. It's not in what you see. It's not in how powerful you are, how well equipped you are, whether you have a king or you don't have a king. In other words, he was kind of, For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands, Goliath. I wish I had time to talk on the battle is the Lord's. Learn that it's not our battle, it's the Lord's battle. And turn it over to him, we would have victories.
Yeah.
All right, verse 45. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, so that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Another sermon. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of his sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. How big do you think that sword was?
Pretty big.
Yeah, I mean, he's 9 feet 6. Now, this ceiling in here is a little over 8. So he'd have been a foot better, taller than this ceiling. So I would assume his sword was probably that long, because they used long swords in those days. Now, I don't think I could have pulled a sword that big out and done anything. I might have got it out, and dragged the tip around. But David had enough strength to pick that sword up and cut his head clear off. Wow. Wow. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they took off. And they headed back toward the coast, Escalon and Gath. And notice what happens. Verse 52. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded, the gates of Ekron, and the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Sharim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So the battle went on. All of a sudden, it wasn't even a battle. It was Israel chasing the Philistines. And as they went toward Ekron, which was probably another 5 to 6 miles from where the battle, you can look on your map, I've got it marked on there, where this battle took place. It was probably maybe 12 to 13 miles from Bethlehem. And you can follow it on out to Ekron and Gath, and you can kind of figure for yourself the mileage there. But as they went, they were killing Philistines right and left. And you'll notice there's a picture of the Philistine armor. That's what it's at the bottom there, so you can kind of see what they look like. They were covered in armor, and yet the Israelites were able to track them down and kill them. And they were wounded all over the roads. And they got to the gates of Ekron, and they ran in and closed the gates. And they got some of them to Gath, and they got in and closed the gates. And Israel wasn't going to siege the towns. They weren't prepared for that. So they turned around and came back, and they went into the camp of the Philistines, and they took all the spoils. Everything the Philistines had. They took everything. And Israel gained a great victory that day. But notice it says that David took the head to Jerusalem. But the armor he put in his tent. Now, there is some question about how that was interpreted. It really should have been the tent. The tent. What was the tent? It was the tabernacle. How do we know that? Because later on, we're going to find that David needed a weapon. He didn't have a sword. And he went to the high priest, who went into the tabernacle. And there behind the altar was a sword wrapped in an ephod. It was the sword of Goliath. And David took that sword and used it as his own sword. Now, I don't know where he got a scabbard. Maybe he wore the scabbard around his neck. I don't know. To keep it from dragging. But we know it was in the temple. And no doubt the armor of Goliath was also in there. Because that was kind of the way they did things in those days. These were trophies. And whenever the priest went into the holy place or went into the tabernacle, they saw the sword and the armor of Goliath. And it reminded them that God can bring the victory in any circumstance. Verse 55. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. So the king said, inquire whose son this young man is. Then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? So David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. So as David was going out to face Goliath, Saul did not. He said, "Who is this kid?
He should have known.
Why didn't he recognize him?" Probably because David had not been there for a while. David had grown from
Yeah.
a kid in his teens when he first came to, in fact, probably 12 years old or so when he first came to Saul to play the harp. And maybe he hadn't been there for a very long time, but now he had filled out, now he was a man. We know he was a good-sized man, or he would never have been able to handle Goliath's sword. He was a big man, maybe not as tall, not over big, but powerful man. He probably had a beard now, hair was different. And Saul probably did not have the slightest clue that musician that played before him
Yeah,
was now the champion of Israel.
Yeah.
And Dave, why was Saul even asking about his father? Because he had promised that whoever defeated Goliath, his father's house would not pay taxes or be
Right.
required to give. See, Saul kept his word. But isn't it wonderful how God works?
He sure is.
We read the story of David and Goliath, and the little guy went out there and won, and it's kind of like, well, God can take a little boy and go out and win a victory. But there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
David was a man, not only after God's own heart, but a man who saw through the eyes of God. Oh, that we could be that way. Any questions?
Yeah. I'm good. That was a good lesson.
I tried to move faster and I just can't get this thing done.
Well, there's a lot of information. Yeah.